You've had a conversation today that never actually happened. Maybe it was with your boss, or your mother, or someone who said something 2 months ago that you still haven't fully processed. You played both parts. You gave them their lines. You gave yourself better ones than you had at the time. And at some point in the middle of it, walking to the fridge, waiting for a light to change, doing absolutely nothing that required your brain, it got so detailed that you had to consciously remind yourself it wasn't real. That's not zoning out. That's something else entirely. Most people assume this is just what minds do when they're bored. And for some people it is. But there's a version of this that doesn't feel like idle background noise. It feels more like a place with a geography. Recurring characters, established rules about how things go, specific tones of voice you've assigned to people who have never actually spoken to you that way. You don't just visit it. You know the layout. The brain has a network. Researchers call it the default mode network that tends to activate most intensely when your attention pulls away from the outside world. Once external demands loosen their grip, this network begins producing something it finds more compelling: internally generated experience. Past conversations, imagined futures, alternative versions of scenes that already happened. For most people, this runs briefly and then stops, but for some, the brain begins treating this internal mode as more rewarding than what's happening in the room. And when that preference settles into a pattern, external reality starts to carry less weight, not because anything is objectively wrong with it, but because it struggles to compete with something your own mind has quietly optimized for you. This is the territory that psychologist L.I. Sommer began mapping formally in the early 2000s, under the term maladaptive daydreaming. What the research surfaced wasn't a distraction problem or a focus issue. People were spending the majority of their conscious hours inside fully constructed interior narratives, detailed, emotionally consistent, often more coherent than their actual lives. It wasn't avoidance in the simple sense. It was a secondary world that had started outrunning the primary one. And the reason it outruns it is worth understanding clearly. The imagined scenario gives you something real interaction almost never can: a guaranteed outcome. You control whether the other person understands you. You control whether the conflict resolves. You control whether you're finally heard. Real conversations don't work like that. Real people are slower, more distracted, and often respond in ways that have nothing to do with what you needed them to say. The imagined version doesn't introduce that uncertainty. And so the brain, which tends to move toward what reliably works, starts returning there, not as a decision exactly, more like water finding a groove. Over time, without any single moment of choosing it, the inner world starts handling emotional needs that reality was supposed to meet. Not because the person gave up on real life, but because the imagined version kept showing up when the real one kept not quite managing to. What's worth noting about who this tends to happen to, there's a meaningful link in the research between this pattern and a trait called absorption, a capacity for deep, total immersive focus. People high in absorption don't experience things at a distance. Music doesn't play in the background. It takes over the room. A hard phone call doesn't end when you hang up. It runs on a loop for days, pulled apart and replayed. And honestly, if you know, you know. This kind of mind doesn't build vague impressions of an inner world. It builds one with emotional logic and weight. The imagined conversations feel real because, experientially, they nearly are. Then comes the part that makes the whole thing harder to step back from. At some point while you're inside one of these scenarios, 15 minutes in, 40 minutes in, some quieter part of you clocks the time, not with alarm, just with awareness. And surfacing carries something that's genuinely difficult to name, not shame exactly, not regret, but a low-grade static that sits somewhere between them. The fastest way to make it stop is to go back in. And so you do. The loop doesn't announce itself as a loop, it just becomes the texture of the day. What the clinical work points toward, though, is that this almost never starts as a problem. For people who grew up in environments where emotional needs consistently went unmet, where home was unpredictable, or connection felt conditional, or being sensitive was treated as something to manage, the interior world wasn't running away from reality. It was building a more dependable version of it. The mind constructed what it needed when the available options weren't enough. That's a creative act, even when it doesn't look like one. The question worth sitting with isn't whether you imagine too much. It's what the imagined version of the conversation is giving you that you haven't yet found a way to ask for out loud. What does the rehearsed exchange resolve that you've quietly stopped believing a real one ever could? That gap between what gets resolved in the imagined scenario and what you won't let yourself actually pursue, that's usually where the real work is waiting. The interior life doesn't need to be dismantled. A mind that can build emotionally coherent worlds in that kind of detail isn't broken. It's capable. The issue has never been the depth of it. It's that somewhere along the way, that depth concluded it was only safe when no one else could see it. If you watched this whole thing and felt something shift quietly, not the mild interest of recognizing a concept, but the specific, slightly uncomfortable feeling of being seen, then you already know this isn't just a casual habit. You built something intricate and private because at some point, the outside didn't offer what it should have. That's worth understanding. And it might be worth asking, carefully, what it would look like if even a small part of it were allowed to exist somewhere other than inside your own head.